slam tonight. That's going to be a new one for me. I've been to poetry slams, but I don't think I've ever been to a fiction slam, so I can hardly wait. You're all, some of you are planning to do some stories. I have to admit I'm a little bit nervous. I usually don't turn my back on scary-looking critters like this, but somebody keep an eye on him, will you, and let me know if I need to move out. I really appreciate Chad's invitation to read here at the Great Plains Writers Series, and it's a real honor to be included among the many great writers who've been here before. You probably hear in my voice that I've got a bit of a cold. That was a gift from my 1-year-old grandson. Otherwise, he's a pretty nice kid. But the background of my novel, Eden to Orizaba, is the 2009 H1N1 swine flu epidemic, which was a precursor of the even more serious pandemic that we've faced for the past 2 years. Though it was not as deadly as COVID-19, the swine flu did kill 12,000 people worldwide and sickened 60 million Americans. The two eruptions have much in common, and I would argue that if we had taken the first pandemic more seriously, we might have been better prepared for the current crisis. And if we really took a close look behind such plagues seriously, we might not be where we are today. Among other things that the two have in common, both pandemics appear to be related to meat production, and in both cases, the failure to act swiftly made matters worse. As the April 2019 outbreak at Smithfield Foods pork plant in Sioux Falls made clear, our globalized, industrialized meat production processes cannot escape scrutiny. A recent investigative report by South Dakota Newswatch illustrates how the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Smithfield executives, and South Dakota's governor's office coordinated an effort to deny the severity of the Sioux Falls outbreak, which in the end sickened over 1,300 people there, killed 4, and for a time put Sioux Falls on the map as the leading COVID-19 hotspot of the nation. This political intervention put many lives at risk and led then President Trump to declare Smithfield workers, mostly immigrant workforce, essential workers who didn't, of course, have the option to stay home. When the dust had settled, Smithfield was assessed a $13,000 fine, $10 per worker that was sickened by their failure to implement sensible protections. Is that what an immigrant worker's life is worth? $10? As a writer, the swine flu epidemic caught my attention, but I didn't know yet in 2009 that the pandemic is thought to have begun in Mexico's Orizaba Valley, or that under NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, Smithfield Foods, the same global corporation for which my character Pablo works in Sioux Falls, had dumped 1 million hogs on unsuspecting villagers in the beautiful valley at the foot of Mexico's highest peak. I had traveled in all parts of Mexico for 50 years, but I had never been to Orizaba. So when I stumbled upon these two pieces of the puzzle, I knew it was time to go there. So my wife Norma and I flew to Mexico City, took the bus to the lovely small city of Orizaba, and from there I traveled to the small pueblos whose traditional economies and ways of life had been irrevocably altered by the presence of 1 million hogs, and whose polluted water and putrefied air are now inescapable aspects of daily life. For 17 years, I taught journalism, and for another 6, I wrote nonfiction stories as managing editor of South Dakota Magazine and as contributing editor of Nebraska Life, including a 2001 story about Norfolk. And I had written both fiction and nonfiction books, So my first question was which way to go with this story. I knew that to tell the story well as a journalist might require much more time in the various locations than I had, and would likely require greater fluency in the Spanish language than I have attained. And fiction has, of course, several advantages. Since the novelist creates conflict, characters, scenes, and dialogue, and even has the godlike power to determine outcomes, not every fact must be verifiable. But perhaps most important, the novelist has greater freedom to shape the story to serve certain ends, and I wanted my story to somehow tell a larger story about who is crossing our southern border and why. I decided to tell the story through the intersecting lives of three imagined characters, Pablo, Maria, and Lantry. Characters that I, of course, hope will be as real to readers as they are to me. Though my characters are not the rapists and criminals that some politicians would have us imagine, neither are they perfect human beings. They're flawed human beings who find themselves facing circumstances beyond their control and who must make difficult choices, which are sometimes the only choices they see. But if my characters are imagined, I think that they are also real. Pablo, Maria, and Lantry are not unlike me, and perhaps not unlike you, and certainly the choices that they face and the decisions they make are similar to those made by the scores of others who cross our borders every day. Think back with me 12 years, if you will, to 2009. Imagine that you're a young man named Pablo. In your 19 years of life, you've left the valley of your birth only once, when a year ago you crossed the Rio Grande on an inflated inner tube and caught a ride north to a place you'd never heard of, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. There you found work, ripping the guts out of pigs 50 hours a week for a corporation called Smithfield Foods. Otherwise, all of your life has passed in the shadow of the snow and ice-capped peak of Orizaba, which rises 18,600 feet above sea level in the Sierra Madre Mountains southeast of Mexico City. Your pueblo is Guadalupe, Victoria, named for the venerated Virgin of Guadalupe, your country's patron saint, and for the victories of your ancestors who in the 19th century drove out European invaders and in the 20th century deposed a homegrown dictator. As a child, your father worked the tiny farm he had inherited from his father, the scrap of ejido land restored to the peasant farmers by the 1910 revolution at the demand of peasant general Emiliano Zapata, whose demand was tierra y libertad, land and liberty. But in your first year of school, everything began to change. Your government and leaders of the powerful nation to the north signed what they called the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Soon, huge trucks like nobody had ever seen rolled into town, loaded with lumber and steel. Your father and most of the other men in town had steady jobs for the first time ever, building row after row after row of long, low barns. Then more trucks came, bringing thousands of pigs, then tens of thousands and tens of thousands more. And by 2008, the valley housed hundreds of barns and 1 million hogs. Now the only jobs available were feeding the hogs and cleaning their excrement from the barns, and the pay was less than a living wage. By now the air was full of stench, and the water from your mountain stream no longer fit to drink. So as a young man, you faced a terrible choice. You left your sweetheart, Maria, and the beautiful valley of your birth and went north. The year in South Dakota dragged on interminably, and when neither you nor Maria could stand the separation any longer, you came home. You had a few $100s in your pocket, enough to pay your mother's bills and to buy gifts, but not enough for a real wedding. So one night just before Christmas, you and Maria made your private vows in the village church. Now it is January 2009, and a new plague has descended upon your valley. People by the dozens are falling ill, including the oldest of your 3 sisters. They need money for medicine and for a doctor, and who knows who might be next. So you say goodbye to your mother, your sisters, and Maria, and do the only thing you know to do. Again, you catch La Bestia, the beast, the freight train north. But this time, the border crossing does not go well. The coyote promises you safety if you carry a bag of marijuana, and because you see no other options, you agree. You're busted at the border checkpoint and sentenced to 2 years in a corporate private prison in a real place called Eden, Texas. Unbeknownst to you, your arrest at the border checkpoint is witnessed by another man, a man who is also waiting at the checkpoint, but on a bus heading south. Lantry is a journalist, or rather a former journalist, from Dallas, Texas. Because of severe alcohol addiction, Lantry has lost everything, including his job and his wife, and is heading for Mexico because he has nothing better to do. Your journeys will cross again one day, but neither of you know that now. The other thing you don't know yet in this day in 2009, which happens to be Valentine's Day, is that the mysterious illness that has swept through your village is the swine flu, the beginning of an epidemic that will rage from hog confinement to hog confinement across vast stretches of the earth, killing millions of animals and thousands of people and sickening millions more. Eden to Orizaba is not intended as strict historical fiction. I have another novel based on the early days of western Oklahoma that is strict historical fiction across the Cimarron. This is really a different kind of novel. But I think the key elements of the story are all facts of history. And the places, including the cities and towns and the prison in Eden, Texas, are real. The exploitation of a valley of traditional farmers by Smithfield Foods is real. The swine flu epidemic that is thought to have begun there was real. The reasons that people leave their ancestral homes, their families, and their loved ones are real. And my purpose in telling this story, I readily admit, is not so different from what motivates most of my writing, both fiction and nonfiction. I want readers to feel and then to think, and perhaps in some way to engage in the perennial struggle for justice and truth. Throughout most of Eden to Orizaba, I alternate between characters' points of view. In the first chapter, we meet Lantry, and in the second chapter, Pablo, and it goes back and forth like that. What I'd like to do today is to read 2 pivotal chapters, and I have to apologize to Bonnie and Neil, who heard this yesterday. You guys can just close your ears if you want, but I appreciate you being here. So, as I mentioned, Pablo's been in this prison in Eden, Texas for quite some time. It is part of this private corporate prison system that the federal government uses to house such folks, and it's pretty ubiquitous around the country. And Lantry, meanwhile, has crossed over into Mexico. He's spent a lot of time in Mexico City. He's still overwhelmed by alcoholism. He's trying to find a way to beat it, so he heads for the mountains, thinking somehow he'll be able to get his head straight up in the mountains. So these are the 2 central chapters of the book, which really are pivotal in both characters' lives. This is chapter 19. It was completely unjust that Pablo had been thrown into the hole again, but here he was. No way was he a leader of what the local newspaper called a riot. Of course, his eyes and ears were open, and yes, he had known what was about to come down. Yes, his shirt was smeared with food, but that was somebody else's doing. He tried to stay clear of the fight. Those who passed the word in the exercise yard were mostly the toughs. men who made no effort to hide their violent past and in fact relished repeating tales that set Pablo's teeth on edge. Some were doing hard time, others had been in this or other joints before. They were men with no wives waiting for them, no particular home to go back to, who saw nothing to lose. If somebody died in the fight, that was a price worth paying, even if that somebody was them. Pablo had no weapons, and in his 2 decades of life had not been involved in so much as a fist fight. Before he knocked the robber off the train, the occurrence of chapter 2, he had never engaged in an act of violence toward another man. The only thing that drove him now was that he had to get out, and he had seen a vague chance. He hadn't even touched the guard. His only goal was to be near the front when the surge of men pushed toward the door. But certain guards seemed to have their eyes on him. One in particular, a pudgy punk named Travis, delighted in threatening to send him back to the hole. His eyes were narrow slits in a pockmarked face, always a stubble of beard. Spit flew when he talked. Pablo detested the guard, but would have gladly walked away from him and never given him another thought. Yet he couldn't help wondering whether he could kill the man if it came to that. He had killed one already, maybe an evil man. He knew that one was one too many, but if another killing was the price of fresh air, he couldn't be sure what he might do. There was no way to know how many they had rounded up. He didn't know how many cells the solitary block contained, but more than he'd been able to count as he was herded past the long string of doors in the dark runway. And anyway, he'd been in no mood to count. What he did know was that he'd seen this corridor twice before, once going in and once coming out. The first lockup, they claimed, was because there wasn't another cell for him, and now after the food fight. One thing seemed sure. They had caged as many men as they had holes to put them in, but maybe others were waiting their turn. Perhaps this time it would be less than 2 weeks, or it might be more. They didn't tell you such things. How long he'd been asleep when he woke to the screaming, he didn't know. It could have been before midnight, or it might have been near sunrise, because every hour of darkness was the same. The only way to gauge the time of night was that at some point the curses and wails and banging from other cells diminished, followed by longer periods of relative calm, though calm rarely lasted long enough for an uninterrupted hour of sleep. Now Pablo was wide awake, searching for the source of the latest outburst. The scream had erupted from the throat of a man who lay bathed in sweat, his own hands gripping his throat. Slowly he realized that man was him. And Maria was not really here. She was in a bed, but not in her bed. It was the bed in a strange place. The scream had escaped from Pablo's throat, but it was Maria's scream, the pain of childbirth. The strangling hands were about her throat, choking her life. Pablo swung his legs off the pallet and struggled to stand. He was drenched with sweat, but his face was also wet with tears. He stood on the bed and strained toward the tiny window, gasping for breath. If only it would open to the night air. No doubt it was another stifling Texas night, but at least it would be air, not the foul, fetid atmosphere of his own body buried in this tomb. Tumba, he muttered aloud. Yes, this was his tomb, the place of death. And by merely uttering the word, he found himself face to face with a question he had never before allowed himself to think. Many hours, both waking and sleeping hours, had been haunted by the man he'd killed on the train. Hours examining his crime, if that's what it was, and by speculation about whether he could kill again, and if so, for what reason. But never before had it occurred to him that he might be better off dead. Now it seemed he would never get out of Eden alive, and if he did, inside he might already be dead. He eyed the threadbare sheet that lay crumpled at the foot of his cot. Of the two things the prison provided, the toilet was a necessity. The sheet on a stifling Texas night was not. Pablo pulled the sheet from its moorings and mopped the sweat from his body. He grabbed a section in each hand and gave it a mighty jerk. The sheet did not rip. He eyed the bars of the tiny window, a half a dozen inch-thick bars covering a window not much more than a foot wide. A tall man might have peered out the window from the far side of the cell, but for Pablo, the square of not quite dark began at the top of his reach. He could tie one end of the sheet to the bar, stand on the mattress, wrap the other end around his neck, and simply step off. It would be easy, even quick. He wondered if that's what he should do. Pablo grasped the corner of the sheet and, standing on the bunk, tied it securely around a bar. The other end he wrapped around his neck. It felt comforting, smooth, cool to his sweating flesh. But how did one tie a knot? That he had never contemplated. He recalled the knots his father had taught him, one for binding a shock of corn stalks, another for leading a horse or a cow. Then there was the slip knot, the one you made if you wanted to drag a heavy load, but then easily set it free. Surely the slip knot would do. He fashioned such a knot and arranged the loop around his neck. From where he stood on the mattress, one star penetrated the dingy little glass. If he moved his head slightly, it disappeared behind a bar. Move his head again, and the faraway light reappeared. Darkness and light, even if the light was very dim, very far away. Staring at the tiny point of light, he for a moment forgot his mission. It seemed the light was directed at him, that it could penetrate his soul. Were other human beings in other places drawn at this moment to this faraway sign, or did it exist only to communicate something to Pablo's troubled mind? He moved his head again, and the star disappeared. Utter darkness or vague distant light, those seemed to be the choices. Long he stood on the bed, stood until the sweat on his body dried to a slimy scum. He took one long breath and removed the noose. He raised on tiptoes and untied the other end of the sheet and pulled it down. He again mopped his body with the cloth, then collapsed on the bed and wept. But he could not shake himself free of Maria's scream, of her body writhing in pain on that strange bed, of the baby that in his dream had emerged from her wonderful womb. He stretched on his back and maneuvered until he found another faraway star. He breathed deeply until he had calmed himself. What if Maria really was pregnant? If she was, then that new life would have begun on one of their far too few nights of lovemaking in January, or possibly from the promise of the gift of her soul and body on Christmas Eve. He couldn't be sure, but he thought August had turned to September. He counted the months, and yes, September was the 9th month. But if there was a baby, and if his dream had communicated what was real, then the baby would have come already, early, and that in itself would be a reason to worry. But the strange bed, where was Maria now? Was she all right? And if in fact she had given birth, was he the father of a daughter or a son? He lay until morning, ever moving his head on the mattress this way or that to maintain contact with whatever wayward star might swim across his narrow view. When the fuller light of morning had begun to rise, Pablo had grown certain of two things. They took the form of resolutions, which he swore to God and to Maria that he would not forget. First, he would not take his own life. If he were to die at 20, it would be at the hands of those who would bury him in this Texas hell. Second, he would not remain here for the lifetime of another 18 months. He would get out one way or another. If he had to die trying, it would not be at his own hand. If he had to kill to be free, perhaps he could do that too. He felt certain that Maria had a daughter or a son, and he would be with them soon. Meanwhile, no more interminable nights of longing for Maria. No more self-pity, he promised himself. No more doubts about the events that had brought him here, or the one great crime that either only he or God could punish, and he vowed it would not be him. No, from this moment on, one thing would occupy his mind, animate his soul, guide his actions, to make and execute a plan of escape. He would escape to life, not death. When the darkness subsided, Pablo swung his bare feet to the cement floor. They splashed in liquid. Was it urine or just water? It wasn't the first time somebody had plugged a toilet and flooded not only his own cell, but the runway and all the cells nearby. Pablo took a closer look and saw that the liquid was not yellow, but red. Somebody had cut himself. By the amount of blood, somebody must be dead. He jerked his feet up, plunged them into the toilet to wash them, dried them with toilet paper. He would remain on the bunk until somebody finally came to mop. A roar of voices began to build up and down the runway, accompanied by bangings on windows and steel doors, curses and howls that escalated to a blood-curdling crescendo. He was not the only man baptized in urine and blood. As he waited, Pablo concentrated on seeking the threads of a plan. He could outlive any dreams of escape at the end of a bed sheet noose, and he could survive another 2 weeks in the hole, or whatever they threw at him, if only he could stay focused on a plan. But this time, he had to act smarter. He was pretty sure that he was smarter than most of the guards, and who knew, perhaps even God was on his side. With that thought, he realized that he had not been in church since he and Maria had made their private commitment to each other beneath the brown and yellow towers. Nor had he spoken to a priest, but without intending to do so, he found himself in prayer. As morning broke, he gazed out the little window at the fading stars and asked God to show him a way out. Thank you. That was just the intermission. Now we're going to shift to Lantry, who's up on the mountain. He has, by accident, found his way to Orizaba and got off the bus because he saw the mountain and hung out in a little pueblo, Pablo's Pueblo, for a few days, and then decided on the spur of the moment he was going to climb Orizaba, which of course was impossible, and he didn't stop to think about it, he just decided to do it. So he's totally unprepared, and he heads up there in the middle of the day. By nightfall, he's too far up to come back, so he builds a little fire to try to stay warm. He's brought no provisions, so he's put himself in a bad spot. A lightning bolt jerked Lantry from his sleep. The crash of thunder was almost immediate, so the strike must have been near. It ricocheted off the rocks and was still rolling down the mountain when it was answered by a blood-curdling cry. Lantry's wide eyes stared into the blackness, searching for the source of the wail. Was it real? An animal? From the thunder? Part of an interrupted dream? How long he had slept he didn't know, but in spite of his hungers and the cold, he felt rested and alive. The fire still burned, so he must have roused at least once to add wood. Lightning flashed again, but its light revealed nothing. It must have come from below his altitude, he decided, or perhaps from a place behind his boulder. He felt sure now what he had heard was not a dream, and he tried to reshape the sound. If the cry was real, was it a coyote, or perhaps a wolf? He didn't know what creatures might prowl the mountain, but it was not so much a howl, he decided, more like a scream. Huddled against the boulder, he breathed deeply of the cold mountain air. He pulled his jacket close to his chest. He listened intently, but heard only the music of the stream. His head felt clear of its usual haze, and the sky was ablaze with stars. Far above all sources of pollution, or even dust, they were the most brilliant he had ever seen. He picked out the Big Dipper and followed the cup's lip to Polaris, the North Star. Lantry averted his eyes from the firmament to search nearby, but he could see little beyond his fire's small circle of light. He had no idea what time it was, except that the dippers hung low in the northwestern sky, so several hours must have passed. Perhaps dawn was near. He raked scattered embers toward the flames, then settled another stick on the fire. When the sparks died away, he lay back on his pine needle bed and closed his eyes. When the scream came again, he was still awake. This time, there was no question that it was real. Whatever creature had produced it must be big, and not far away. But what? He was pretty sure it was some kind of cat. Did mountain lions roam Orizaba's forest? He recalled that Antonio had mentioned jaguars. He hoped he would not find out. He was sure that he would sleep no more. He could only wait and hope that daylight would come soon. But minutes became an hour, his tension eased, his eyes grew heavy, and again he must have drifted off to sleep. When Lantry rose again to consciousness, it was to the whisper of an intermittent, gentle wind. He stirred and opened his eyes on the blackness of the sky, pierced by the million points of light. The new sound that had roused him was guttural, a low, rhythmic rumble. He rolled his head toward the fire. Beyond the now flickering flame, two other fires burned through the blackness. The blazing yellow orbs, fire reflected from the eyes of a huge tawny cat. Now the creature moved. Squatting low in its haunches, it slinked one step toward the fire. The nostrils flared and sniffed. The upper lip curled, and out came a breathy snarl. Then the mouth opened wide, bearing a bevy of flesh-tearing teeth. Lantry felt frozen to the earth, flat on his back between the boulder and the fire, the cat not more than 10 feet away. The face was yellowish brown, white on the mouth, dark on the long whiskered cheeks. The cougar crouched low, surveying the prone man and the fire. It crept another step closer, its wide pink tongue lolling between its teeth. Its bared claws were curved and long. Lantry realized that he was not breathing. He inhaled deeply, then his hand crept slowly toward the fire and gripped the end of a burning stick. With deliberation that an observer might have described as calm, he raised the burning limb slowly above his head. Then he threw his body up with a mighty yell and lunged toward the cat, jabbing with the torch with all his might toward the hungry eyes. Now he was on his feet, swinging the faggot as the cat screamed once more and leaped many times beyond its body length and disappeared into the brush. For how long he stood with the burning stick in his hand, Lantry could not have told. But finally, he became aware that the ember, his arm, his very body, all were shaking beyond control, and his mind had lost all focus. He dropped to his knees by the fire and shoved the remaining fuel onto the flames. The fire rose to consume the new offering. When he had calmed himself a bit, he stood and carried the blazing stick before him as a light and a shield, and broke off more dead branches that had sheltered from the rain. He built the fire to a roaring blaze, and for the first time since the sun went down, he became truly warm. Satisfied that the fire would last until morning, he stretched out once more, as near to the fire as he dared, and in spite of all intentions, drifted back to sleep. When Lantry next woke, the sun had risen. He lay without moving and stared beyond his boulder toward Orizaba's crown. The sun had not cleared the glistening peak, but had encircled it with a halo of pink. Chilling images of the night replayed in his mind. At last he stretched his back, sore and stiff from sleeping on the cold, lumpy earth. He rolled to his elbows and gazed through a break in the forest out toward the plain. Down the path he had come, splinters of light danced amongst the trees and underbrush before dissolving into a vast sea of clouds that spread as far as he could see. The entire world below was calmed and smooth and white. Only he and the mountain peak stood in the sunshine above the fog. His fire was nearly dead now, only smoldering embers and wisps of smoke. His pack lay beside him undisturbed. In fact, all seemed peaceful, secure. He rose to his knees and crawled beyond the fire to search the forest floor where the big cat had crouched. The thick bed of needles appeared undisturbed. Like an archaeologist searching for clues to the past, he carefully brushed the needles aside. He could discern no tracks. Surely there would have been something, he thought. If nothing else, some disturbance where the cat had leaped away. He found no clues. Could the whole thing have been a dream? Surely not. If so, it had undoubtedly been the most vivid dream in his life, and a dream not induced by alcohol. But perhaps there would have been no tracks. The needles on which he slept were a good inch thick. Lantry walked to the stream and stripped off his clothes. Shivering in the cold mountain air, he washed his face and then his body, and then pulled on clean clothes from his pack. He fell to his knees and drank the sweet water of Orizaba. Then, in a manner that had eluded him for a very long time, gave thanks. He found that his stomach was collapsing with hunger. He went back to his pack, emptied the last few peanuts from the bag, and wolfed them down to the salty dust. He peeled and ate the last orange, drank again from the bottle that held the cold elixir from above. The dwarfed pines overhead had been cleansed of dust by the evening rain. The water in the stream was crystal clear, and the snowy peak stood in stunning relief against the blue, blue sky. Everything in Lantry's purview was vibrant and clean. He realized that his mind, too, seemed clearer than it had been in months, maybe years. He was weak from hunger and still shaky with shock at what he had experienced, but it was morning and his head did not throb. He recapped with amazement the many miles hiked up the slope of the sleeping volcano. He had slept well by a distilling fire and had fended off a hungry lion, but most remarkably, he had slept without alcohol and had awakened rested. He searched his memory for the last day and night without a drink, not to mention several too many. Was it before college? For as far back as he could reach, alcohol had been essential to his life. Lantry opened his pack and lifted the half bottle of tequila free. He twisted off the cap and sniffed the contents. He brought to his lips the taste of the bittersweet flavor dried on the rim. The urge to pour the liquid fire into his mouth was still there, still powerful as ever. In spite of how good he felt in the freshness of the morning on the mountain, he wanted this drink as much as he ever had. He clenched the bottle in his fist and held it away. He raised it to the rising sun. Through the pale liquor and the curvature of the glass, the colors of a rainbow appeared. And then he was aware that the mirage was both softened and enhanced by tears. In a single motion, he flung the liquid into the coals. The fire flared for an instant, then died back to its warming tone. Lantry raked the pine needles away from the coals and snuffed the embers with his boot. He went back to the stream, rinsed the bottle 3 times, and filled it with the melted snow. He drank the bottle empty, refilled it to douse the last dying embers, then filled it again. He shouldered his pack and gazed long at the snow-covered peak, unattainably far above. At last, he turned his feet down the trail he had come, a path that in the morning light seemed new. Thank you. And I would welcome any questions or comments or whatever you might have to say. I'd like to hear from you. I left you speechless?
Pretty much, yeah.
I'm just thinking about the giant cat from the story.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have any of my students here. You guys have?
Yeah, Jared, do you prefer fiction or nonfiction? I mean, or is it just whatever the task requires?
Yeah, the latter.
Yeah.
You know, I've written 3 of each, and 3 books of each. So I just felt that fiction was the way to go with this, and I think it was the right choice for me. But regarding the cat, you know, even though this is not a historical novel per se, part of the historical research, I didn't climb the 18,600 foot peak either. I was pretty much where Lantry was, but I did a lot of research about jaguars in that region, and they're pretty rare. You know, I wanted to put a jaguar in there, but I thought, okay, that's pushing limits. Yes, there are lots of mountain lions, so let it be a mountain lion. Mountain lions are scary enough for me.
I was struck this time by the parallels in those 2 passages. The screen in each of them is so important. It just sort of awakes him to something that he's confronting, but also the stars. You know, it's that the stars have this way.
Yeah, I'm not sure to what extent that was intentional. I think most of it just evolved, but yeah, I think about that too, how parallel the 2 stories are at this central point. This is sort of the apex of the story, and the rest is the bane him off, you might say, you know, unwinding of the tale and all the conflicts that are to be resolved.
We made a connection to Steinbeck last night. That was interesting.
Yeah, I mentioned yesterday that Steinbeck is one of my favorite authors, and in fact, I was a college graduate when I was drafted into the Army during the Vietnam War, and I hadn't read a whole lot of literature, and I picked up a copy of The Grapes of Wrath and was reading it in my pup tent by flashlight, and partly because my family is the Okies. They were the ones too poor to go to California. They stayed behind. It really spoke to me, but I ended up doing my PhD dissertation on Steinbeck, and you're probably alluding to the fact that I noticed in close study that if you count, I think there's 567 pages in the copy of Grapes of Wrath that I have, and the precise middle page in the book is where they cross the line into California. So the first half is, you know, the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, the travails of getting to California. The second half is what happens after they get there. I don't know whether Steinbeck intended that way or not, but it just, when I realized that this was turning out to be the focal point, the central point in my book, I thought, wow, maybe I'll learn something out of it. But I think it's mostly happenstance. Other questions? So I'm curious, are these all your students or many students? I see lots of...
I don't know these people. I don't Some of them are out there, yeah. There's a couple different classes here. And
Well, it's really great to have a large group of college students. I sometimes miss teaching college. When I'm not grading papers especially. But it's really nice to have this good turnout, and I appreciate your being here and listening. And you know, we writers do this lonely work, and without readers and listeners, it'd be all pretty futile. So, thank you. If there's a final question, I have it. Otherwise, otherwise, if anybody would like to look at my books out there, I've got a few. Thanks a lot.